Hi, and welcome to the Bible, my cats and I. I want to start today with a story. When I was in second grade, I had the best teacher, Mr. Hazen. Mr. Hazen believed that a quality education included a lot of field trips. We probably went on one every month, I don't know. And he had this system where he would choose a child to sit next to him on the bus, a couple of children. Throughout the year, every child got a chance to sit next to Mr. Hazen and have that special seat. It wasn't like we earned it or anything, not like we had to score high on a test in order to get that right. It was his way of having some nice one-on-one time with each child. But we all wanted it, and we all knew that it was something special. Well, one day, we went on a field trip to Hershey's chocolate factory. I know, it was great. And I was sure that that day was my day to sit next to Mr. Hazen on the bus. Only when the names were called out, I wasn't on the list. And I remember to this day being so upset about that. It was so unfair. I was so sure that I was going to get the special treatment that day. I remember him sitting down and comforting me and assuring me that my day would come when I could sit next to him. I didn't really deserve the special treatment. It was a gift. It was a gift from the teacher. And by golly, all of us were going on a field trip. We were going to the chocolate factory, and we were all going to arrive at the same time. But somehow, I thought it was my privilege, my entitlement to get that special treatment that day. This brings us to a story that we're going to study today out of the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 20. Jesus tells a story that's very much like this. Now, if you've been with us all along, you'll know that we just covered in chapter 19 the story of the rich man, the rich young ruler who came to Jesus and said, "What must I do? What must I do?" That's a key word, in order to get eternal life. And so this story is related to what we read about in chapter 19. If you haven't read that chapter, press pause, go ahead and read that. If you haven't read chapter 20, please do the same and read through chapter 20. Let me take us back then to what we had just studied in chapter 19 about this rich young ruler. Jesus took his words and altered them slightly from doing and getting to entering into the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus knew his heart. It was clear from his words that he was all about ambition and accumulation. So Jesus knocked off that idol from the throne of this young man's life and said, what you need to do is get rid of that paradigm and sell all that you have and give that money to the poor. Then you will have gotten rid of that thing that was taking God's place in your life. And God will be able to come in and you will be able to live that life with God like you are seeking. But this was too hard for the young ruler. And he walked away very sad because he didn't think that he could do it. And Jesus says it's very difficult for the wealthy to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Well, this surprised the disciples because it was thought material blessings were blessings from God. And so if somebody who had a lot of material blessings couldn't enter into the kingdom of heaven, then what's out there for the rest of us? And Jesus said, this may be difficult for you, but with God, all things are possible. And then we read about Peter. Peter pipes up and says, but what about us? What about us? We've given everything to follow you. It's an interesting question that comes from Peter. It sort of shows that he had this scarcity mentality, if you will, like there's only just enough to go around. And he wants to be assured, because they've given everything, that they're going to get their fair share back, that they're going to get something actually even more than that because they've given everything. What's in it for us is his question. Now, what we're going to be studying today is sort of Jesus' extended answer to Peter. First, he assures him, don't worry, you're going to be rewarded way above and beyond. But then he goes into this parable, which explains it even more. Now, I go through all of this because what we're going to be studying today flows so well from that. So I wanted to recapture all of that and bring us into Jesus' response, which is this beautiful parable about the workers in the field. And it extends what it was that he was trying to explain to Peter earlier. And we sort of have a hint here that it flows. I don't want the chapter division to go against us and think, oh, okay, it's chapter 20, now we're going to be talking about something new. And the person who ended up developing the chapter system in the Bible apparently was very aware of this, because if you look at chapter 19, verse 30, remember there didn't used to be chapters and verses, but if you look at verse 30, it says, but many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. But then later, then it goes into chapter 20, and later in chapter 20, in verse 16, it echoes that same phrase where it says, so the last will be first and the first will be last. This is a clue to us that this passage we're about to read is an extension of what was going on in chapter 19. Those two phrases that echo each other are what are called an inclusio, or we could call them bookends. And whenever you see something like that, you can know that everything that happens within there is a section that should be read all together. Well, that's pretty clear in this one because it's all one parable. But also the fact that that first part of the inclusio is in chapter 19. You know that this is in response to all of this that's going on about the kingdom economics, the way God's economics work. Let's read the first 16 verses of chapter 20 together. I don't normally read all this much when I do these lessons, but I'm going to read the whole parable. So here we go. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire men to work in his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About the third hour, which would be 9 o'clock, okay? About the third hour, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, you also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right. So they went. He went out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour, so noon and 3 o'clock, and did the same thing. About the 11th hour, 5 o'clock, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, why have you been standing here all day long, doing nothing? Because no one has hired us, they answered. Well, he said to them, you also go and work in my vineyard. When the evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first. The workers who were hired about the 11th hour came and each received a denarius. So when those who came who were hired first, they expected to receive more, but each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. These men who were hired last worked only 1 hour, they said, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day. But he answered one of them, friend, I'm not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the man who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last. This passage is pretty basic, actually. It doesn't have any real plays on words. The Greek is pretty straightforward. There's no major social historical context that you need to know about. But for those who have ears to hear, it is so timely and applicable even today, right? I mean, well, let's first start. The kingdom of heaven is what my Bible says, the kingdom of heaven. And I just want to remind you, kingdom of God means the same thing. And I've said before that sort of when God's ways are happening here in the world, when God gets to have it God's way. Okay. And again, here, the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner. Now, the landowner, just like in the parables that we read in chapter 13, the main character of this, the landowner, the merchant, the woman, is typically symbolic for God, stands in place of God. So here again, in this, you can read symbolism for God in this. And we know that this way of hiring is practiced even today. That's why we don't really have to know too much about the social historical context. We see it. You've seen it. There are people hanging out on a street corner in the morning, waiting for someone to come by to hire them for the day. The business owners know where to go, the corner, the parking lot, wherever, in order to find laborers for that day. And the laborers know where they can go in order to find work for the day. It's a tough system, and it requires quite a bit of effort on the worker's part, often, in order to gain the place in the back of the truck, if you will. And the workers are very vulnerable. There's no contract. There's no union to help support you. All there is a verbal agreement between you and the jefe. Just someone who tells you what they're going to pay after you have done the work. So there's quite a bit of trust involved. So the landowner goes out and he hires his workers with a verbal agreement. And all are in agreement to the pay. They're going to receive a denarius for their day's work. And a denarius was a typical day's wages, a fair day's wages for a day of work. However, again, look at the level of trust here. They go out and they have this agreement, but then the level of trust grows as the day goes on, because then when the landowner goes out at the third hour at 9 o'clock, he says, you also go and work in my vineyard and I will pay you whatever is right. He doesn't even give them an amount. He just says, I'm going to pay you whatever is right, which is important to the story. But there's this, again, this incredible level of trust that they have to believe that this person for whom they're going to work is a good person and is going to come through on his word. Finally, towards the end of the day at around 5 o'clock, he goes out and he hires workers who have been standing around all day, asking them, so why are you still standing? And they said, because no one has hired us. Why would that be? Are these guys misfits? Are they somehow undesirables? Maybe they're not aggressive enough to push others out of the way, to jump into the cart, if you know what I mean. Maybe they're not strong. Perhaps they're more disabled, or just somehow they don't seem to have what it takes. They're not the ones who fit the bill, if you will, for some reason for them to have not been hired by the end of the day. So he takes them on. These undesirables, these ones that are left behind, he takes them on. But when they get paid at the end of the day, the same amount that the workers who began at the beginning of the day, those workers who are hired first look on and they become discontented and begin to grumble. And in fact, it appears they even have a spokesperson. Now, this to me makes this story real. Isn't this the way it goes? If you see something happen, doesn't seem fair, you start to talk amongst yourselves, this little group, and then the group decides to send Charlie to go and talk to the landowner about their grievances, right? They have a spokesperson because it says, but he answered one of them. So the landowner was actually having a conversation with a representative of those who were grumbling, the ones who were hired first. I love this little detail in the story. I don't want you to make too much out of the order in which people are paid. I think this is more of a literary device in order to move the story along, because it's not really about that those people who are hired last are going to get blessed first before all of those who have been in God's kingdom all along, working away for the kingdom, and that they're not going to get theirs till later. It's not about that. This story is about equality of pay. This story is about being rewarded equally. Everybody gets there the same time, just like on the field trip. In the end, there's equality for all. The first hires are discontented because of their expectations, I guess, their assumptions about fairness and the way things are supposed to run according to worldly economics. They saw those last workers get paid the denarius, and they probably expected that to represent an hourly wage. So they probably expected, if they got that much for an hour and we've worked 12 hours, then we're probably going to get paid 12 times what they were paid. We're going to get 12 denarius. They were expecting that they were going to get paid maybe even 12 times a day's wage for one day's work. I mean, time to go to Rosie's bar after that, right? This would have been great, but that's not the way it happened. But their mistake was thinking comparatively. They were not thinking about equality. They were offended, in fact, by equality for all. And it came down to equal rewards for maybe differing opportunities. It didn't seem fair to them. And in the end, the landowner gives not only what is fair, he gave what he promised, and he gave a fair day's wage, and he gave what was agreed upon. But he gave not only that, he gave extravagantly. And this is what the story really is all about, this extravagance, this abundance that comes from the landowner. And then I love what he says here. Do I not have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you jealous because I am generous? Or another way to say this, are you annoyed because I'm benevolent to others? Oh, that hits deep. And that is the lesson here that we have to listen to at the end. Are you jealous because I am so generous? We have a lot to learn about God in that one line. Unfortunately, I hear grumbling a lot. I've run into it a lot. And this is sort of what it sounds like. Okay? Well, fill in the blanks as you will. But here's an example. My dad is abusive and a drug addict. And you're telling me that if at the last minute he decides to turn his life around and follow Jesus' ways, then he is going to enter into eternal life. While I have spent all my life working for the church and living a life with God and being a good person and everything, that is just not fair. I will not accept that. he doesn't deserve it. This sounds a lot like Peter's concern, doesn't it? Like, what's in it for me then? If they can get in, then what's in it for me? Because I've given everything. And Jesus is trying to teach here that it's not about the scarcity mentality. That is not kingdom economics. You're thinking in a worldly way, but that's not the way that God works. And I love, Rob Bell even says, the world is not a pie, okay? There aren't just so many pieces to go around, and then that's it. No, it's infinite. God's love and generosity and benevolence is infinite, and there is plenty to go around for everyone and in abundance. Now, if we want to bring this home, this is not just about how the landowner works. This is not just about how God works. But it's about how God gets to have things God's way as well, in that you and I are called to reflect the divine into the world. And so therefore, you and I are called to reflect this kind of kingdom economics into the world. Economics of abundance, of generosity, of compassion, and equality for all. Welcoming in the misfits and those who are left behind, if you will. Being generous and gracious. Celebrating that everybody gets the win. Everybody gets to go on the field trip. Life with the divine is like everybody gets to go to the chocolate factory. And that's what we are called to represent into the world. In closing, I want to take a bird's eye view of chapter 20. Since we're not going to read through the whole thing, we can't do that. But I want you to get a sense for the overarching feel of chapter 20. It's important. So it starts out with this parable that's sort of about entitlement, right? And how that doesn't really work in God's kingdom economics. And then later on, it ends with this story about the mother of James and John coming to Jesus and basically trying to secure for them their ambitions of being able to secure the seat next to the teacher, right? And it's so interesting that in Matthew, it's the mother who comes to Jesus to seek these ambitions for her sons. In the other Gospels, it's just them directly. So we're dealing with entitlement and we're dealing with ambitions in this chapter, and how neither one of them work within God's kingdom economics. And the reason why we know that is because of what the author inserts right in the middle, in between these two stories. And that is how Jesus says God's kingdom economics are going to play out in his own life, even in his life. Let me read you what he says. We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will turn him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. On the third day, he will be raised to life. God's economics are just not the same as our worldly economics. And Jesus emphasizes here, it's not going to seem fair. But in the end, all who follow will be rewarded. And this passage right here prepares us for what we're going to start studying throughout the rest of the Gospel of Matthew. What happens when they go to Jerusalem and beyond. I look forward to covering that with you. And right now, I just offer you blessings, abundant abundant blessings and generosity so that you may reflect that out into the world. May grace and peace dwell within you. Blessings.